Hello, hope you're all well and having a lovely week. Today we're just going to do a little short episode. I was inspired by How to Win Friends and Influence People, this book by Dale Carnegie. So I've been reading this and it's really about kind of business strategies, but also like how to be a good person and like resolve conflicts or not even create them in the first place. And a lot of it kind of stems from just like awareness of how you're acting too. But I thought it would be interesting just to kind of like go over one of the principles that's really standing out for me. And I thought I'd just share my perspective and also like some of the things that they brought up, including like some quotes and stuff from him and from the people that he like draws upon to reach his conclusions and to like inform his perspective. So today it's just going to be me. I'm in Sydney and Brendan's still in the Gong, so in Wollongong. So it'll just be me. Yeah, let's get stuck into it. So the chapter that really is resonating with me and the one that I thought would be great to do a bit of an episode on and to discuss is called A Sure Way of Making Enemies and How to Avoid It. So kind of like the premise or the overarching idea of this chapter is basically saying that like if we're in an argument or if we're in a conversation, a lot of the time we're focusing on how conflict is an attack on ourselves or like our ego or like an attack on I basically or my. So I've kind of framed it as like arguments or disagreements stemming from I. So I think like it's really common when we just conversate in general to be reflecting on like our own personal experiences and our own like autobiographical memory and the things that make us to ourselves, how we also want to be perceived to the exterior world as well. And a lot of the time we have an agenda without even realizing it, or it might not, maybe not agenda, maybe agenda is not the right word to use, but like instead maybe we come from a point of like protection of ourselves or trying to like be on the defense, even if it's not like necessarily our intention. So Carnegie brings up a quote from James Harvey and his book on The Mind in the Making. And the quote goes like this: "The little word my is the most important one in human affairs, and properly to reckon with it is the beginning of wisdom." So it's the emphasis on my, and that if we look further into it or kind of peel back the layers of my, is when we can get further to the truth, because it can resolve, like there's always 2 points to an argument, or like if you're coming from my, you're putting in your perspective and it's subjective, and that will always be the case if it's like an opinion. So I just think it's interesting to talk about like the removal of my, or like breaking that down or kind of poking it a little bit is the beginning of wisdom, which is a really important and interesting perspective to have. Another thing that he brings up is Carl Rogers and a passage from his book on becoming a person, and I'll read this out. It says, "I have found it of enormous value when I can permit myself to understand the other person. The way in which I have worded this statement may seem strange to you. It is necessary to permit oneself to understand another? I think it is. Our first reaction to most of the statements which we hear from other people is an evaluation or judgment, rather than an understanding of it. When someone expresses some feeling, attitude, or belief, our tendency is almost immediately to feel that's right, or that's stupid, or that's abnormal, that's unreasonable, that's incorrect, that's not nice. Very rarely do we permit ourselves to understand precisely what the meaning of the statement is to the other person." So I think that statement's important because it brings out the points of like, we aren't seeing the objective truth of the other's perspective or statement. Like everything that comes to us or that comes to our mind or to our consciousness is going through a filter of previously understood concepts. We have like a history or a backlog of like every word that is said to us comes with like a kind of a branch or a stem or like links to other concepts that we've previously, already made our mind up on. So when someone is saying something to us and we have a slightly different branch or a pathway or a meaning or a definition for a word or a concept, that is when we can start to make judgments on what the other person is saying. And from there, we can begin to like construe or like make assumptions on who that person is, where they're coming from, what their perspective is, what their point is, and like maybe like why did they even bring this up in the first place. Those things start to like poke the ego because they're our fundamental understandings of the world, and that's like quite fragile when there's an apparent mismatch of ideas. It creates conflict in our mind and in our ego that we can immediately become defensive, and if not defensive, it's more just like dismissive or hung up on the point in which there was a conflict in whatever they were saying. And by conflict, I don't mean like, it doesn't have to be aggressive, it just might be like a misunderstanding, but therefore we don't actually hear the other person's point because we're still like hung up on that and ruminating and going to our own subjective opinions on that point. And therefore we can't actually get to the root of their meaning or their intention or their point. Like, why did they bring this up to us? What do they truly mean from that? And I think it comes down to like, we all don't have the same meanings for things, or we all understand everything like slightly differently, which is super helpful because that's the way that the world can go round, and that's the way that we can like creatively think, because we need differing perspectives to like move forward and to like question and to investigate topics and concepts. Like, it's really important concept. But yeah, it's just interesting that it can like limit the truth too. It can limit our ability to connect with someone and from there confrontation or kind of like a separation of like intimacy or closeness can start to form, because you might go, oh, this person thinks this and that isn't what I think, and therefore like let's try and find some other holes in their argument or their conversation. So I just think that's a really interesting perspective and something to really think about when we are in like the heat of an argument, or even just a usual conversation, a very nice, polite conversation that comes from the intention of both individuals wanting to get closer to another, but the ego kind of intervenes, or like the person on the devil on your shoulder is whispering like ridicule or trying to find holes. So it's not even that we initially come to the conversation from an angle, it just eventually sometimes turns that way when it sparks something of slight conflict or slight mismatch of your prior understanding. So these are some quotes that kind of simplify what I've just said, or simplify like Carl Rudge's passage into just like fragments of like easily digestible understanding. So Galileo said, "You cannot teach a man anything, you can only help him to find it within himself." So we'll only be willing or susceptible or understanding of something if we want to, and if we find it through our own understanding or meaning of the world as well. Like, we have to see it from our perspective or have it translated into our knowledge or our vocabulary or definitions of the world in order to fully understand their truth and what they mean, which I think is so true and so important to think about. Lord Chesterfield said to his son, "Be wiser than other people if you can, but do not tell them so." So refrain from passing judgment and imposing a superiority against others, because that creates a defensive wall within us. Socrates said, "One thing I know, and that is that I know nothing." So when you're having a conversation with someone, or even a conversation with yourself, it's great to think that like there are parts of the whole that aren't being addressed, and that if you come from the perspective of you know nothing, or that your picture of the world or of a concept or of a topic or anything is only part the truth, you will be so much more susceptible to absorbing more of that truth, more of that whole, and creating and giving room and like letting knowledge breathe and grow. Because if we come from, oh, I already know that, it's actually a wall. Like it's actually shutting off new perspectives, new growth, new knowledge, if we instantly block it, which can come from a disagreement or ruminating on something that slightly didn't click with us. Instead, Socrates is saying that if we come from the perspective of, I know nothing, please tell me more, we can actually widen our perspectives and our horizon starts to broaden, which is really cool. I thought sharing that would be of interest because it was for me. I'm really loving this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I'm just over slightly halfway through it, but I think some of the lessons in it are so amazing and I really resonate with it. And obviously these things can't be front of mind always in conversations, but the more that we talk about them and think about them, the more that they can kind of begin to live in our head and become a habit and process of thinking through our conversations. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really appreciate it. I hope you got something out of it. See you next week. Bye.